Hey everyone, my name is David Williams and this is going to be my presentation on disaster management in India. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the historical context of disaster in India. We'll also be seeking to find out what motivated the changes in India's national agenda, the 2005 Disaster Management Act, which changed the whole perspective of the national government, the task force review of the Disaster Management Act that took place in 2013, and finally we'll be determining how successful it's been. Looking at the historical context of disasters in India, we first have to talk about famine, which is easily the biggest killer and the biggest threat to India's society. It comes about as a reliance on rainfall at proper times of the year. If, say, crops don't get enough rainfall during June and July, no amount of rainfall in August and September will replenish those crops, and the farmer will lose those crops as a result. Further, there's no artificial watering mechanism in place to prevent that kind of reliance on rainfall. And there's also typically famine comes as a result of high food prices and possibly a lack of work when food is abundant. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, some devastating death tolls as a result of these famines. The 1865 one resulted partially out of a disregard by the government, and they didn't think it was such a big deal until rioting and looting started becoming a commonplace occurrence. And by then, when they finally decided to effect some kind of response, by then already 1.3 million people had died. You'll see in the same era, 8 years later, only 23 people died because the government was well prepared and understood the kind of vulnerability the state had. So they went against that. They tried to mitigate as best they could. And then the last one in 1943, that came as a result of the government resting on its laurels and also as a result of the World War II. While famine is India's biggest threat, it's also prone to several other disasters, including cyclones, earthquakes, and tsunamis, as we see here. While famine has been a threat to India since before British colonial rule, it's only been recently that India decided to pursue a national disaster management plan. And as we saw in the previous slides, in Orissa, the cyclone created complete devastation along the eastern coastline, and it forced states to pursue some kind of disaster management system. Then, in 2001, the Gujarat earthquake motivated the national government to do the same, but it kind of dragged its feet. Then, the Indian Ocean tsunami forced the government to run full speed ahead with this national disaster management plan. And in the middle of all this, in the 1990s, the UN-sponsored International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, it all kind of formed a perfect storm, if you will, that kind of created India's sense of disaster. So the Disaster Management Act was instituted in 2005, and it established 4 main disaster management agencies at the national level. The National Disaster Management Authority was the overarching authority for disaster management, obviously. It dealt with the national plan, policies, plans, procedures, and everyone answered to this authority, including the government of India itself, regarding disasters. The National Executive Committee was essentially the executive arm of the NDMA. It did whatever the NDMA needed. It dealt with state and district authorities. Essentially, it just made sure that everything went smooth. The National Institute of Disaster Management was the research arm of the NDMA. It dealt with training, capacity building, and research in the fields of disaster management. And finally, the National Disaster Response Force was a national-level response force tasked with difficult situations in response and recovery during disasters. And overall, the overarching approach to this system is a top-down approach. There are national-level, state-level, and district-level disaster management agencies, but obviously no local. In 2013, a review was conducted by the Ministry of Home Affairs in the Government of India to determine how the DMA was working out. The National Disaster Management Authority was deemed well suited for its tasks, but it should be given more responsibility. The National Executive Committee was deemed unnecessary because prior to the DMA of 2005, another agency was created called the National Crisis Management Committee, and this committee essentially took over during times of disaster. So we had the National Executive Committee only effective during peacetime, and when a disaster struck, when you would normally expect a disaster agency to come up and rise up, it actually fell away. So it was deemed unnecessary, and essentially the review wanted the National Crisis Management Committee to take over the NEC's place. The Disaster Response Force was an amazing tool the review found, and it didn't need any real substantive changes. Finally, the National Institute for Disaster Management performed well enough for the review, but it found that it needed more freedom in how it acquired personnel, and also suggested that it get better connections with state disaster management authorities. Finally, and probably best for India, there was a question of local disaster management authorities, and the task force suggested that local disaster management authorities be implemented in some of the largest municipalities. Now, obviously, that's not completely a bottom-up approach, but it's a nice step in. So in determining if the DMA was successful or not for India, we have to understand that in the last 150 years, India has come quite a long way. In the 19th century, there was a very large disconnect between the people suffering under these conditions and the government. Since then, the government has become extremely involved, and with the help of several other disasters in the recent history, it's become extremely involved in mitigation and preparedness rather than response and recovery, and it's just got a more focused effort on disaster management. It's still a top-down approach with national, state, and district level agencies and none lower than that, but there is some push, I think, towards stronger local agencies, stronger local disaster management authorities. And finally, every governmental ministry in India is required to maintain a plan regarding its role during disaster situations, and that just speaks to India holding itself responsible to its citizens, which is an impressive feat for India. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.